tudo bem? Welcome back to Portuguese Lessons with Professor Jason. In today's lesson, I'd like to review the present indicative conjugations of regular AR, ER, and IR verbs. But I'm going to add some new information about pronunciation that makes this a more advanced lesson. Now, just so you know, I've already uploaded lessons on basic verb conjugation in the present and the past indicative in Portuguese. But what I want to do in this lesson, besides reviewing those regular forms and endings, is to point out a subtle but important change in the pronunciation pattern that occurs with certain AR and ER verbs in particular, right? So let's get this started with a review of the personal subject pronouns in Portuguese. Okay, so what we see here are the personal subject pronouns that we use all the time in Brazilian Portuguese. By the way, they're called pronomes pessoais retos in Portuguese. Okay, we have a couple grayed out, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. We have eu for I, você for you, ele, he, ela, she, nós, we, vocês is the plural, you guys or you all, eles for them or they, if there's men in the group, and elas for they, them, etc., when the group is comprised all of women. Now, why did I gray out tu, right? Tu, like você, means you, but it's only used in certain regional dialects throughout Brazil. So it's not that important to learn. Why complicate things learning another form, right? You can just use você. With vós, you never want to use it because it's archaic. It's never used in modern Brazilian Portuguese. You'll only see it in older documents, things like that, the Bible, etc. Okay? So those are the personal subject pronouns. Right. Moving on to the next slide, we can see something important, which is the fact that these pronouns only require us to use 4 different verb forms. Okay? Another thing to keep in mind is that when you say eu falo and nós falamos, to a certain extent you're being redundant because the ending on falo and the ending on falamos and the corresponding endings for ER and IR verbs can only mean the first person singular or the first person plural. So it's typical for native speakers to suppress the pronoun eu or nós. Okay? With the third person forms, things can get a little bit more ambiguous. So many times you will hear você, ele, or elas, as the case may be. All right? So to sound more native, try not to use eu every time you conjugate in the first person singular or nós, right, with falamos. All right? All right. So what we're looking at now is a example of a regular AR verb, falar. Okay? You can see the endings. Eu falo, você fala, nós falamos, vocês falam. These same endings would be applied to any other regular AR verb. For example, estudar, right? Eu estudo, você estuda, ele estuda, nós estudamos, vocês estudam, or eles estudam. Remember that final form, falam, estudam, the AM in the spelling really signifies a nasal diphthong. Falam, estudam. Okay? On the next slide, just as pattern verbs again as examples, I present an ER verb, viver, and an IR verb, abrir. Okay? So it would be eu vivo, você vive, nós vivemos, vocês vivem. Again, a nasal diphthong represented by those 2 final letters, EM, vivem. Okay? With an IR verb like abrir, to open, eu abro, você abre, nós abrimos, vocês or eles or elas abrem. I've put an asterisk on the nós forms just so you can notice that those are the only forms that are different when we compare ER and IR verbs. The other forms have the exact same endings. Okay? Okay, now back to the verbs themselves. Notice that with falar, the verb follows a regular pronunciation pattern. The vowel and the stem is consistent, sounds the same in each form. Listen. Eu falo inglês e português. I have the wrong accent on português, sorry. Você fala alemão. Ele fala sobre o tempo. Nós falamos por celular. Eles falam na praia. Okay? I just give this verb as an example of a regular verb in which the vowel and the stem remains consistent. All right, let's start talking about this change in the pronunciation pattern I referred to earlier. We just saw falar as an example of the irregular pattern, okay? I've already uploaded a video on vowel pronunciation in Brazilian Portuguese. In that video, I talk a lot about closed and open vowels. But let me just give a few quick examples of these vowels before we look at the verbs, okay? In Portuguese, remember, we have closed vowels and open vowels, okay? And on this slide, you can see contrast between a closed E, an open E, a closed O, and an open O. I'm going to pronounce them and see if you can hear the difference, all right? And then pronounce them along with me. We have the difference between mesa, closed E, and meta, open E. Mesa, meta, or tema, teste, tema, teste, okay? Moving on to the O sounds, we have novo versus nove, novo, nove, or bolo, cake, versus bola, bolo, uma bola, okay? So rewind that part if you didn't quite hear the difference and practice making those different vowel sounds, okay? Okay, now back to our verbs. With AR verbs, there's an important change in the pronunciation of the tonic or stressed vowel in the stem when that vowel is an E or an O, two sounds we were just practicing. Now what happens, pay attention, is that the pronunciation of the E or the O in the stem, which is normally closed, opens in the eu, você, ele, ela, and eles, elas, and vocês positions. In other words, it opens in all forms except nós, we. I'm going to give some examples, okay? Notice that the vowel will be closed in the infinitive and the nós form. In all other forms, the vowel will be open. So try to repeat them with me as I say them and getting that contrast between the closed vowel in the infinitive and the open vowel in those other forms. Let's begin with começar. Começar. Eu começo o curso amanhã. Você começa o curso amanhã. Ele começa, but nós começamos o curso amanhã. Nós começamos o curso amanhã. Close. Eles começam o curso amanhã. Open. Same situation with levar, to carry, to take something. Eu levo livro na mochila. Você leva livro na mochila. Ela leva livro na mochila. But nós levamos livro. Back to open. Elas levam livro na mochila. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and look at some verbs that are also AR verbs, but the vowel in the stem is an O. Same rule. The O is going to open, although it's closed in the infinitive, morar, gostar. It's going to open in all the conjugated forms except for the nós form. Okay? So we have morar. Eu moro nos Estados Unidos. Você mora nos Estados Unidos. Ele mora, but nós moramos nos Estados Unidos. Nós moramos. Back to open. Eles moram nos Estados Unidos. Eles moram nos Estados Unidos. It's subtle, but it's there. With gostar, extremely important, versatile, crucial verb. Eu gosto. Você gosta. Ela gosta. But nós gostamos de ir. Nós gostamos de ir ao cinema. And back to the open position. Elas gostam de ir ao cinema. So hopefully you can hear that contrast. Okay, now we're going to talk about the ER verbs, which have a similar pattern. First, let's look at a verb that follows the regular pronunciation pattern. In this case, viver, which means to live. In this case, the vowel in the stem, the I, pronounced E, is consistent with all conjugations. Eu vivo em Springfield. Você vive no Rio. Ele vive cantando. He's always singing. Nós vivemos juntos. Eles vivem lá em Portugal. Okay, so that E, the I, is consistent in each form. Now we're going to contrast that in cases, or with cases, in which the E in the stem, okay, in the vowels beber, and escrever opens in the third person singular and third person plural forms. So again, the rule is slightly different than with the AR verbs. Okay, the E in the stem of beber, escrever, and similar verbs is going to open in the third person singular and plural forms. Examples: eu bebo, close E, suco de laranja. Eu bebo suco de laranja. But você bebe suco. Ele bebe suco de laranja. But it's close again in nós. Nós bebemos suco de laranja. Open again in eles. Eles bebem suco. Okay? So, eu bebo, você bebe. You hear that difference. With escrever, just another example of an ER verb with an E in the stem. Eu escrevo, but você escreve. So you can hear that contrast between escrevo and escreve. Ela escreve artigo, but nós escrevemos artigo. Back to open in elas. Elas escrevem artigo. By the way, you can hear that difference between the open and close E, or the close and open E, I should say, if you contrast the pronouns ele, close, and ela, open. Okay, it's also important to get it right there. How about verbs with an open and close, or a close and open O? You can hear the close vowel in the infinitive, sofrer, or escolher, or comer, but it's going to open again in the conjugation of the third person singular and plural forms. So we have eu sofro de insônia, close O, but você sofre de insônia. Ele sofre de insônia. Back to close in nós. Nós sofremos de insônia. Back to open in the plural. Eles sofrem, or vocês sofrem de insônia. Escolher would be a similar verb, would follow the same pattern. I have an asterisk here with comer because for many people that M, the nasal consonant, bilabial nasal consonant, is going to keep that O relatively closed. So some people might say você come, but others very well would say você come poucos vegetais. So eu como, você come. Again, we have that distinction. Nós comemos, eles comem. Okay? But again, an M sound tends to close off the vowel. All right? But technically, the verb would fit the pattern, and you'll hear people pronounce the third person forms open. Você come. Okay? Ele come poucos vegetais. Okay, that concludes my lesson on the pronunciation changes that affect certain AR and ER verbs in Brazilian Portuguese. I hope that you found it to be beneficial. You can always rewind it and review it if there was something that was a little bit complicated. As always, I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions, so please take a couple minutes, leave me a comment, and let me know what you thought about this video lesson, all right? Until next time, this has been Professor Jason. Thanks again for watching. Até logo. Ciao.